If you've just tuned in, we've just come out of that briefing by 3 Chapter 9 institutions on what they've described as systemic failures in the justice system. They've really focused on the acquittal of televangelist Timothy Omotoso and his 2 co-accused. The Nigerian televangelist faced a litany of serious charges, including rape and human trafficking, 32 charges in all. Let's unpack the story further and bring in Leanne Germanos Manuel. She's the director and co-founder of the Embrace Project. Leanne, it's great to have you with us in such an important conversation being had by these 3 Chapter 9 institutions who say they can't stand by and just let Timothy Omotoso and his 2 co-accused get off scot-free, given the charges they faced and given the details of the case.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me on the platform to speak about this really shocking outcome. But shocking in the sense that I guess a travesty of justice, not really based sort of on the finding of the judge in this case, but rather on what she said, and in particular about what she said regarding the National Prosecuting Authority's role in this matter. I think that is really what has jolted the South African public more than anything else. And yeah, I mean, you know, everybody is innocent until proven guilty. And what the judge said in this matter was that the National Prosecuting Authority didn't manage to prove that Timothy Omotoso was guilty.
Yeah, and the Mail and Guardian writes about that exact issue, Leanne. It talks about the most disturbing part of the case being that the prosecutor seemed not to know the legal definition of rape. I mean, how do you go into court on behalf of the state pursuing a case of this nature without a detail like that?
Look, to be honest, Michelle, I also have now sort of become a fay with the judgment. I read it. It's a 27-page judgment by Judge Skuman, who detailed everything, you know, in a very succinct but very direct manner. There was a point in the judgment where she stated that the prosecutor who was leading this case had said that, you know, he one of the reasons for his errors was that he was not aware that, and I'm going to quote the judgment, digital penetration of genitalia amounts to rape. And the judge in her judgment says that she finds this excuse by the leading prosecutor to be either inconceivable because he had been prosecuting matters for 14 years, or he was actually just being, you know, he was either incompetent or dishonest. That's basically what the judge came to find. And to be honest, I personally also find it very difficult to believe that a prosecutor of 14 years is not aware that if you use any object to penetrate genitalia, that you don't know that that is rape. That is something very basic that we are taught at university while we're being taught the law. So I don't know if it's so much a matter of a prosecutor not knowing what the definition of rape was, as opposed to potential dishonesty, as the judge actually points out in her judgment.
Yeah, a huge miscarriage of justice. The question, Leanne, is what does this do for other survivors of sexual violence? We know, or those of us who haven't experienced it can imagine what it must take for a survivor to come forward, to have their lives laid bare in court, and to try and get justice for something like rape and sexual violence. What does this do now for other survivors who are contemplating pursuing charges?
I think that's actually the most important aspect of this outcome, of this travesty of justice, is what it means for survivors coming forward. I think in this case, the prosecution had over 10 complainants come forward. The amount of courage that it takes for survivors of sexual assault to, first of all, report what has happened to them, and then second of all, go through an entire trial where they have to recount the trauma that they lived through is beyond our imagining. You know, unless you are in the the unfortunate position of being a rape survivor yourself. You cannot imagine the trauma that one has to go through, but also the bravery that it takes to come forward. And I can say this because as the Embrace Project, we are currently challenging the definition of rape. The matter was heard before the High Court, and the High Court actually granted judgment in our favor and decided that the current definition is actually unconstitutional, needs to be changed so that there is a slightly different test used, which we believe would actually increase the rape conviction rate, which really sits at the moment at 1% of the number of rapes reported to police annually, which is an abysmal statistic. And the reason we were able to bring this matter to court was because a rape survivor came forward to our organization and said to us, look, I was raped and I reported my matter to the police, and I was one of the lucky ones who had my day in court where the prosecuting authority did take the matter forward and my accused was tried. But in her case, the magistrate found that also she couldn't convict the accused in our rape survivor's case because of the definition of rape. That wasn't a shortcoming on the National Prosecuting Authority's side. They had done everything they possibly could and were able to show that there had been an unlawful sexual penetration of the accused without her consent. But they couldn't show that there was an intent on the part of the accused to commit rape, which is actually what we believe to be the biggest barrier for conviction. So, I mean, just looking at that, if the court, if the High Court, for example, hadn't found in our favor, I don't know how our rape survivor would have felt. I don't know how she would have felt about not only reliving the trauma by going through a rape trial and having her accused acquitted, but then having the law and the justice system fail her again when she came forward to say, look, don't you think you should relook at this definition? So I cannot imagine what these survivors are going through at the moment. And I also cannot imagine what the potential threat or effect is on their lives. Because if you're dealing with persons who are also accused of racketeering, syndicates like that don't take survivors coming forward very lightly.
Yeah. And one of the statistics you mentioned, before we continue with our conversation though, Leanne, and I apologize to our viewers, this is a bit late, but this conversation obviously contains details of a sexual and graphic nature, and we do want to forewarn you if you are just tuning in. But one of the statistics you mentioned, Leanne, was that 1% of reported rape cases result in convictions, and that's important, right? 1% of reported rape cases. And we know the reporting numbers are incredibly low in our country, so that conviction rate is probably much, much lower than even that 1%.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. So the thing about our conviction rates at the moment is the way that the National Prosecuting Authority reports what I would call, I guess, its key performance indicators is if you were to look at the National Prosecuting Authority's statistics, they would tell you that they have an 83% or a 90-something% conviction rate. But that's because their percentages are based on the number of cases that they bring before the court. So out of the 40,000 rape cases reported to the police, about 3,000 of those, or perhaps even less, because usually the prosecuting authority only tells you about the number of sexual offences cases that they manage to prosecute and take to trial. So of the 40,000 rape cases, less than 3,000 of them see the inside of a court. And then even less than those 3,000 result in convictions. So, while the prosecuting authority's conviction rates may look great on paper, when you compare it to the number of reported rapes at police stations, because we are now also using the police statistics, it's what I said, it's 1%. You have a 1% conviction rate of the number of reported cases to the police. And we don't know what the real statistics are in terms of the number of rape cases or the number of rapes that we're looking at because of things like this, where survivors feel like if they go forward to the police, They either won't be assisted or they'll have to relive the trauma without actually seeing justice being done. Even in the judgment itself, the judge recounts an incident where one of the survivors, one of the complainants, laid a complaint with the police. And the police told her to just go back to the church and sort the issue out with the church. So they didn't even take down her complaint, which speaks to really an overhaul of the justice system, having to look at how our police are trained when it comes to sexual offences, and now also having to look at how our National Prosecuting Authority is trained when it comes to prosecuting sexual offences.
Yeah, and that's what these 3 Chapter 9 institutions have talked about. They want to go back to the very beginning of the process when a survivor does come forward. How are they dealt with by police, by someone in their school, a principal perhaps that they go to? What do you think is the reason? And surely NPA failures and police failures must contribute to the scourge of gender-based violence in our country, Leanne. In your experience working in the field of GBV, just these past couple of weeks, we've had several cases of sexual violence reported by children as young as 6, as 7. What do you think is happening? I'm not saying it's unique to South Africa, but we know we have some of the highest GBV rates in the world, comparable to countries who use rape as a weapon of war.
We actually have the highest GBV rate in the world, in particular rape rate. And I think to speak to the failures of the criminal justice system, you have to look at all of the different levels. So it's not just the police and the National Prosecuting Authority that fail survivors, but the judiciary does sometimes as well. I've read some really shocking judgments by magistrates and judges when it comes to sometimes even sentencing around a conviction of sexual offense. And I think here the key to remember is that our police, our prosecutors, and our judges all come from the society that we live in. And we live in quite a violent society, particularly a violent society for women and children with such high rates of gender-based violence. So when we're looking at having a justice system that works for survivors and victims, we're actually having to go back even further and not just look at, what is the experience of a victim when it comes to reporting a sexual offense to the police, which is the first step. But rather, how is it that we as a South African society understand gender-based violence? What is our perception of it? And how do we change society's understanding around gender-based violence, what's considered acceptable behavior and isn't? We have to do that first, because that is where we get our police, that is where we get our prosecutors and our judges from. And in as much as I agree that these failures in the justice system contribute to GBV and our GBV rate, I think it would be unfair to say that without taking into account the fact that, these are just people in the end, and people who are living in the same society where it's likely that either sexual violence has been perpetrated against them as police, as prosecutors, as judges and magistrates, or they have grown up in an environment where that kind of behavior has happened and has been seen as acceptable, or has resulted in some sort of desensitization to these kinds of violations. When you put on your police or prosecutorial or judge's hat, your experiences as a person don't just dissipate. So I think there has to be a very conscious effort to train our police, our prosecutors, our judiciary around sexual offenses, around how to deal with victims and how to prosecute and investigate and judge such matters. And I think it's a lot harder because of the society that we come from. So I really think it has to be a much more of a bottom-up approach.
Sure. What a devastating perspective. Leanne Germanos, Manuel, let me thank you for your time. She's the director and the co-founder of a GBV advocacy organization called the Embrace Project.